You're not angry that I sent for you. It was necessary for me to see you.
Serious and stern set of her lips, he could see behind the veil, immediately changed his state of mind.
I angry? But how did you come? Why here?
Never mind. Come, we must talk.
He understood something had happened, that this meeting was not going to be joyful. In her presence, he had no will of his own, not knowing the reason for anxiety, but he already felt that this same anxiety involuntarily communicated itself to him.
What is it? What?
She walked a few steps in silence, gathering her courage, and suddenly stopped.
I didn't tell you yesterday that on the way home with Alexei Alexandrovich, I told him everything. I said that I could not be his wife, that I told him everything.
He listened to her, involuntarily leaning his whole body towards her as if wishing in this way to soften the difficulty of her situation. But as soon as she'd said it, she suddenly straightened up and his face acquired a proud and stern expression.
Yes, it's better, 1,000 times better. I understand how difficult it was.
But she wasn't listening to his words. She was reading his thoughts in the expression of his face. She couldn't have known that his expression reflected the first thought that occurred to him, that a duel was now inevitable. The thought of a duel had never entered her head, and therefore she explained this momentary expression of sternness differently. Having received her husband's letter, she already knew in the depths of her soul everything would remain as before, that she would be unable to scorn her position, to leave her son, unite herself with her lover. The morning spent at Princess Tverskoy's had confirmed her still more in that. But all the same, this meeting was extremely important to her. She hoped it would change their situation and save her. If at this news he should say to her resolutely, passionately, without a moment's hesitation,
abandon everything and fly away with me.
She would leave her son and go with him, but the news did not produce in him what she expected. He only seemed insulted by something.
It wasn't the least bit difficult. It got done by itself.
I understand.
He interrupted, taking the letter without reading it and trying to calm her.
I wished for one thing, I asked for one thing, to break up this situation in order to devote my life to your happiness.
Why are you telling me that? Could I possibly doubt it if I did?
Who's that coming?
Vronsky says suddenly, pointing at two ladies coming towards them.
Maybe they know us.
He hastened to turn down a sidewalk, drawing her after him.
But I don't care. As I said, that is not the point. I cannot doubt that, but there is what he writes. Here is what he writes to me. Read it.
Again, as in the first moment of the news of her break with her husband, Vronsky, while reading the letter, involuntarily yielded to the natural impression aroused in him by his attitude towards the insulted husband. Now, as he held the letter in his hands, he involuntarily pictured to himself the challenge he'd probably find today or tomorrow, the duel itself, during which he'd stand with the same cold and proud expression now on his face, having fired into the air, awaiting the insulted husband's shot. And at once there flashed into his head what he himself had thought that morning, that it was better not to bind himself. And he knew he couldn't tell her this thought. Having read the letter, he raised his eyes to her, and there was no firmness in his look. She understood at once that he already thought it over to himself. She knew that whatever he might tell her, he would not say everything he thought. And she understood her last hope had been disappointed. This was not what she'd expected. One of the most... We go straight on to the next thing, because another great thing, the extraordinary thing about why I think Tolstoy felt that he sort of had mixed feelings, didn't like theatricality so much, because the great drama in all Tolstoy's writing, the greatest drama, are interior monologues. He invents stream of consciousness writing. I'm sure James Joyce actually took a lot. Often the speech is broken, and there are these gaps. What is actually said is often portrayed by body language rather than actually the words themselves. And one of the greatest passages, a stream of consciousness, so fierce, and it's taken directly from Tolstoy's life, is when Levin, the second hero, really the hero of the male hero of the book, and this, again, is out of time. It speaks to us all. How many parents in here? You're all parents, except for Kit, who is going to be one, as well as the star. This is what happens when Levin is waiting for the birth of his child, his wife, Kitty.
He did not know whether it was late or early. The candles were all burning low. Dolly had just come to the study to suggest that the doctor lie down. Levin sat there listening to the doctor tell about a quack, mesmerist, and watching the ashes of his cigarette. It was a period of rest, and he'd become oblivious. He'd entirely forgotten what was going on now. He listened to the doctor's story and understood it. Suddenly, there was a scream unlike anything he had ever heard. The scream was so terrible that Levin didn't even jump up, but, holding his breath, gave the doctor a frightened, questioning look. The doctor cocked his head to one side, listening, and smiled approvingly. It was all so extraordinary that nothing any longer astonished Levin. Probably it should be so, he thought, and went on sitting. Whose scream was it? He jumped up, ran tiptoe to the bedroom, went round Lizaveta Petrovna and the princess, and stood in his place at the head of the bed. The screaming had ceased. But something was changed now. What, he did not see or understand, nor did he want to see and understand. But he saw it from Lizaveta Petrovna's face. Her face was stern and pale and still just as resolute, though her jaws twitched a little and her eyes were fixed on Kitty. Kitty's burning, tormented face, with a strand of hair stuck to her sweaty forehead, was turned to him and sought his eyes. Her raised hands asked for his. Seizing his hands in her sweaty hands, she started pressing them to her face.
Don't leave, don't leave. I'm afraid, I'm afraid.
She spoke quickly.
Mama, take my earrings, they bother me. You're not afraid? Oh, God, soon. Lizaveta Petrovna, soon.
She spoke quickly, and tried to smile. But suddenly her face became distorted and she pushed him away from her.
No, it's terrible. I'll die. Go, go.
She cried, and again came that scream that was unlike anything in the world. Levin clutched his head and ran out of the room. He knew that all was now lost. Leaning his head against the doorpost, he stood in the next room and heard a shrieking and howling such as he had never heard before. And he knew that these cries were coming from what once had been Kitty. He had long ceased wishing for the child. He now hated this child. He did not even wish for her to live now. He only wished for an end to this terrible suffering. Doctor, what is it? What is it, my God? He said, seizing the doctor by the arm as he came in.
It's nearly over.
And the doctor's face was so serious as he said it that Levin understood this nearly over to mean she was dying. Forgetting himself, he ran into the bedroom. The first thing he saw was Lizaveta Petrovna's face. It was still more stern and frowning. Kitty's face was not there. In place of it, where it used to be, was something dreadful, both in its strange look and in the sound that came from it. He leant his head against the wooden bedstead, feeling his heart was bursting. The terrible screaming would not stop. It became still more terrible, and then, as if reaching the final limit of the terrible, it suddenly stopped. Levin did not believe his ears, but there could be no doubt. The screaming stopped, and there was a quiet stirring, a rustle and quick breathing, and her faltering, alive, gentle, and happy voice softly said,
It's over.
He raised his head, her arms resting strengthlessly on the blanket, remarkably beautiful and quiet. She silently looked at him and tried, but was unable to smile.
It, you ain't heard nothing yet. It nearly is over, but the last section we're going to give you is actually my favorite in all of Tolstoy's writing. It comes from great climactic moment in War and Peace. And Tolstoy really is, as a lot of people have noticed, two writers. He's the writer of power, of the public world, of the absurdity of history. But he's also the writer of you, as you've been listening to, of the intensity and complicated truth of the passions between men and women, and between brothers and friends and sisters and children and parents. And all these things come together at a particular moment. The moment is this. Natasha, the extraordinary, exuberant girl at the heart of War and Peace, who's based actually on Tolstoy's own wife's younger sister, Tanya, has been engaged, been married to the cold, brilliant Prince Andrei, who, like an idiot, has said we have to wait for a year to see if it really is going to be good. And during the year, which is unbearable for someone of Natasha's warm blood, she almost elopes. She falls in love with someone who's already married, as we discovered, Anatol Karagin, a beautiful no-goodnik, a technical Russian term. And she's discovered and she's disgraced. And what happens to this life force of War and Peace is that she becomes ill, she hates everybody, she hates her family, she who would love them all, she hates herself, she's close to dying of all this terrible feeling, and then eventually somehow this spectral wraith of a girl comes back to life, and looking on all the time is Pierre Bezukhov, another version of Tolstoy. Pierre, who'd wanted Andrei and Natasha to be married, but who finds himself caught between them. He wants to be a friend to Natasha, but something inside his heart and his body and his head also wants to be something more. Most of all, he wants to somehow, he knows he can't bring Natasha and Pierre back together, but most of all, what? No, you can't. Of course not. Tolstoy, no, this, let's just do it. Let's just do this here.
Natasha, wasted, with a pale and stern face, not at all shamefaced as Pierre expected her to be, was standing in the middle of the drawing room. When Pierre appeared at the doorway, she became flustered, obviously undecided whether to go to him or wait for him. Pierre hastily went up to her. He thought that she would give him her hand, as always, but coming close to him, she stopped, breathing heavily and lowering her arms lifelessly, in exactly the same pose in which she came out to the middle of the room to sing, but with quite a different expression.
Pyotr Kirillich, Prince Bolkonsky was your friend. Is your friend.
She corrected herself. It seemed to her that everything only was, and that now it was all different.
He told me then to turn to you.
Pierre sniffed silently, looking up at her. Up to then, he had reproached her in his soul and had tried to despise her. But now he felt such pity for her that there was no room in his soul for reproach.
He's here now. Tell him to forgive me.
She stopped and began to breathe still more rapidly, but she did not cry.
Yes.
Yes. Yes, I'll tell him, but he did not know what to say. Natasha was evidently afraid of the thought that might have occurred to Pierre.
No, I know it's all over. No, it can never be. I'm only tormented by the wrong I've done him. Tell him only that I beg him to forgive me for everything.
Her whole body shook and she sat down on a chair. A feeling of pity such as he had never experienced before overflowed Pierre's soul. I'll tell him everything once more. But I'd like to know one thing.
What?
I'd like to know whether you loved. Pierre did not know what to call Anatole, and he blushed at the thought of him. Whether you loved that bad man.
Don't call him bad. But I don't know. I don't know anything.
She began to cry again. A still greater feeling of pity, tenderness, and love took hold of Pierre. He felt tears flowing behind his spectacles and hoped they would not be noticed. Let's not talk anymore, my friend. It seemed so strange suddenly for Natasha to hear that meek, tender, heartfelt voice. Let's not talk, my friend. I'll tell him everything. But one thing I ask you, consider me your friend. And if you need help, advice, or simply to pour out your soul to somebody, not now, but when your soul is clear, remember me. I'll be happy to if I'm able.
Don't talk to me like that. I'm not worthy of it.
She was about to leave the room, but Pierre held her back by the hand. He knew he had something more to tell her, but when he said it, he was surprised at his words himself. Stop it, stop it! You have your whole life ahead of you.
Ahead of me? No. For me, all is lost.
All is lost. If I were not I, but the handsomest, brightest, and best man in the world, and I was free, I would go on my knees this minute and ask for your hand and your love. Natasha, for the first time in many days, wept tears of gratitude and tenderness, and after glancing at Pierre, left the room. Pierre, too, following her, almost ran out to the front hall, holding back the tears of tenderness and happiness that choked him, put on his coat and, missing the sleeves, got into the sleigh. "Where to now, sir?" asked the coachman. "Where to?" Pierre asked himself. Where can I go now? Not to the club or to pay visits. All people seemed so pitiful, so poor in comparison with the feeling of tenderness and love he experienced, in comparison with that softened, grateful glance she'd given him at the last moment through her tears. "Home," said Pierre, throwing open the bearskin coat on his broad, joyfully breathing chest despite the 10 degrees of frost. It was cold and clear. Above the city's semi-dark streets, above the black roofs, stood the stark, starry sky. Only looking at the sky did Pierre not feel the insulting baseness of everything earthly compared with the height his soul had risen to. At the entrance to Arbat Square, the huge expanse of the dark, starry night opened out to Pierre's eyes. Almost in the middle of that sky, over Prechestensky Boulevard, stood the huge, bright comet of the year 1812. Surrounded, strewn with stars on all skies, but different from them in its closeness to the earth, its white light and long raised tail. The same comet which presaged, as they said, all sorts of horrors and the end of the world. But for Pierre, this bright star with its long, luminous tail did not arouse any frightening feeling. On the contrary, Pierre, his eyes wet with tears, gazed joyfully at this bright star, which, having flown with inexpressible speed through immeasurable space on its parabolic course, suddenly, like an arrow piercing the earth, seemed to have struck here, its one chosen spot in the black sky, and stopped. Its tail raised energetically, its white light shining and playing among the countless other shimmering stars. It seemed to Pierre that this star answered fully to what was, in his softened and encouraged soul, now blossoming into new life.